When you think of power, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it government? Is it nuclear weapons of mass destruction? Maybe it's the power that we receive from our very own sun. Maybe you think about power that's produced from the force of the waters of the Niagara Falls. If you're really imaginative, you have images of Zeus hurling bolts of thunder down from Mount Olympus towards the Titans. Regardless of what your mind associates with power, there's one thing that all powerful things have in common, and that's their ability to influence, control, and subdue their surroundings. While most, if not all of us, can easily identify examples of power in our everyday lives, one of the most unsuspecting places to look for or even associate with power is literature. Literature is often overlooked, and although literature might be farther down most of our lists of things I associate with power, it has been a constant and recurring and consistent theme and often driving force of literature, probably since the beginning of time, or at least pretty close to it. And while there's no shortage of great literary works to choose from when discussing this subject of power, two stand out among the crowd for me personally. They are The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an autobiography by, obviously, Frederick Douglass himself, and Punishment by Rabindranath Tagore. In many cases, power is attributed to one or a small select few, and they usually obtain it primarily by force. They take it, they grab it for themselves. And once they have it, they solidify that power through established institutions that are created to maintain and hold power. In Douglas's world, that power was given solely to the whites, and those of color were immediately stripped of all their power, and they were powerless. And the powers kept this system in place through slavery, the institution of slavery, which kept slaves uneducated, ignorant, and therefore, you know, continually slave. In Tagore's world of punishment, power is held by men because of India's highly paternalistic society. Men decided most of the things that happened in culture, most of the societal things that happened, men decided them. And therefore, women were oftentimes powerless in many situations, unable to speak up because they had no voice. This model or structure of power is exemplified by Cheatham's treatment of his wife on page 967 of the Norton Anthology, when he threatens her, saying, "I'll break every bone in your body," during an argument. Then later in the same scene, forcefully dragging her by the hair and locking her in a room. This begs the question, how do those without power obtain power? Well, I believe there are two very important and I think crucial factors to those who for those to get who without power to gain power. Those are knowledge and education and truth. I mean, knowledge and education, that could be very well be Douglas's mantra for his life. Uh, it is through knowledge and education that built the foundation for Douglas's eventual freedom and freedom from bondage of slavery. On page 531 of the anthology, Douglas writes, "From that moment I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom." At that time in his life, he had gained a certain aspect of knowledge, and it clicked in his head. He'd always wondered why the white people had power and the black people did not. And at this moment in his life, he understood it's knowledge, it's education, and he ran with it. The same goes for Chandara in her life. Although it was a little slightly different, but she obtained her first glimpse of power, or the first real driving force of power, when she realized how little her husband cared for her, when she understood the truth of her husband's feelings for her in her life. On page 967 of the anthology, Tagore writes, Chandara stared at him, stunned. Her black eyes burnt him like fire. Then she shrank back, as if to escape his devilish clutches. She turned her heart and soul away from him. At this moment, Chandara understands how her husband truly feels about her, how he really views her, and how she's just something to be used for his own gain. And at that moment, through her knowledge, acknowledgement of truth, she finally can take hold of her life and begin to take power. And this is the catalyst for all the power that she gradually takes through the rest of the story. Another thing I notice is that power is actually very relative. Depending on whose point of view or where you're looking at it, power can seem to be in one person's hands when it's actually in another's, and vice versa. This is seen in Douglas's narrative when he says on page 531, Whistle, I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress. I was gladdened by the invaluable institution, by the valuable instructions, by the merest accident I had gained from my master. You know, Douglas, at this moment in Douglas's life, it seemed as if something was being taken from him. This opportunity to learn and knowledge, and opportunity to gain more knowledge through his life. But while it seemed like power was being taken from him at that moment, in actuality, he was gaining an even greater understanding, a greater education that led him to have the greatest epiphany of his life and the most power that he's ever had. Same goes for Chandara when her husband asks her to take the blame for what her brother-in-law had done. While she obeys her husband, Chidam, and reluctantly so, she does so on her own terms. She takes power, she takes matters in her own hand. Chidam wanted to have his cake and eat it too, if you want to say that, because he wanted to get his brother out of trouble, yet save his own wife at the same time, but using her to do so. Chidam, having this newfound truth, uses her power to influence. On page 968, when the magistrates and the courts are questioning her about this heinous act, she doesn't reluctantly, but she without flinching, responds, "Yes, I killed her." To the questions of, did she kill her sister-in-law? She responds, "Yes." It's amazing. And even her own husband, her own husband can describes her power. The power which I like to say is her power. Her most valuable asset of power is her unpredictability, by describing her as a handful of mercury on page 967, something that you can't really hold. You can't contain mercury in your hand because of its liquid state. And that's where Chandara's power lies. Finally, I noticed that power is actually very fickle. It has no master. It doesn't, pick favorites. Power just kind of flows the flow of things. And this is plainly apparent in both stories. Throughout both stories, the power struggle is changing from back and forth, back and forth. In Douglas's life, when he was very young, he realizes that he doesn't have much power. On page 517, first chapter of the story, Douglas writes, "The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege." Early on in his life, Douglas has memories and remembers of times when he didn't have power. He didn't have the ability to even know his own age. something that is supposedly believed to be inherent for every person to own. At that time of his life, the white supremacy, the controlling powers of his life, they had the power. But later on, as we discussed earlier, once he understood where power lied and education was power in itself, he took that power back. This is another shift, it shifted from power being in the power of the whites and those who enslaved him to the power back into his hands. But once again, later on in the story, when Covey is sent, when Douglas is sent to Mr. Covey's house, Mr. Covey's plantation, that power is once again stripped from him. On page 545, Douglas writes, "The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold a man transformed into a brute." See, slavery begins in the mind. And if you can break a person's mind, you can make them a slave. That's exactly what happens to Douglas at this moment in his life. It's probably the lowest and deepest moment of his life that he's been in. That power is stripped from him at this moment. But not for long. And later, and near the climax of the story, he physically and forcefully takes that power back. And at that moment, he understands and he has such a firm grasp on power that he believes he will never, ever become a slave again. He never, ever can be subdued again. Page 549 exemplifies this in one of the most important and influential quotes of the entire narrative when he says, "I now resolve that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day passed forever when I could be a slave in fact." Like I said before, slavery starts in the mind. Slavery begins in the mind. So if you can free yourself from bondage in your mind, you can be free. This same power struggle translates over into Tagore's world of punishment. You see, power is initially in Shidam's hands as he forcefully abuses his wife, as we spoke before on page 967, you know, threatening to break her bones and throwing her in a room and locking her up. But later she escapes, and the power is shifted back into Chandara's hands. Chidam, as he begs and pleads for her to return to him, now Chandara holds the power. Tagore writes on page 967 that, verse 7, "But he had to surrender to her." And in that scene, in order to get his wife back, Chidam had to surrender to his wife. You only use the word surrender if someone has power over another person. And then once more the power is given back to the husband and to the man when he asks when he asks his wife to take the blame for the fall for the murder. And being the society rules, she reluctantly obeyed, as we spoke before. But finally, in the end of the story, that power is taken back when she goes out on her own terms. She does things in her own terms. Like we spoke before, her unpredictability is what her power is. She took death and left her husband with possibly an even worse fate, the real punishment of having to live with maybe the guilt of his wife. See, power is a very interesting and dynamic concept in literature. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy looking at the aspects of power in these two works and how they relate to humanity and how they portray humanity in each and every one of us. And I hope that power can continue to be driving forces of work and this concept of power and understanding it and trying to understand human nature. And I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.